At 3 in the afternoon on March 7th, 1945, a sound rolled across the small Rhine town of Remagen that no one on either bank would forget. It was not the deep, final crack the German engineers had been waiting for. It was something smaller, almost embarrassed, a muffled cough of weak explosive and torn metal, followed by a slow rain of rivets and dust into the cold green water below. On the western bluffs, American soldiers crouched in the rubble of a railway yard and stared. Through the smoke they could see the long iron arch of the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, sagging, scorched, but standing. On the eastern bank, a German engineer captain who had just twisted the handle of a detonator twice felt his stomach drop. He had been told that if the bridge fell into American hands, he would be shot. He had also been told that if he blew it too early, he would be shot. He had done everything correctly, and the bridge was still there. Within 4 hours, the first American infantryman would sprint across that span. Within 32 hours, United States Army engineers, working under direct artillery fire in the open river, would lay a 1,032-foot tactical bridge of pneumatic floats and steel treadway alongside it. Within 10 days, more than 125,000 American soldiers would be on the eastern bank of the river that Germans had called their last great moat for almost 2,000 years. To the men who held the German high command in early 1945, the speed of what happened on the Rhine that March was not just a defeat. It was an event that did not fit the world they understood. They had calculated and war-gamed for years that an opposed crossing of the Rhine would consume 4 to 6 weeks of Allied preparation, hundreds of barges, weeks of bombardment, and at least one division of Allied losses per crossing site. The Americans took the Rhine in hours. They built bridges across it at a pace measured by the foot per minute. They did it under jet bombers, ballistic missiles, frogmen, the heaviest mortar in the world, and the largest concentration of anti-aircraft fire in the history of the United States Army. The men who did it carried shovels and outboard motors and treadway pins. They were the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and what they did between March 7 and the end of March 1945 is one of the great untold engineering achievements of the 20th century. To understand why the Germans could not believe it, you have to first understand the river. The Rhine is roughly 766 miles long. Where it bends through Germany, between the Black Forest and the North Sea, it averages about 1,300 feet wide. In March, swollen by snowmelt and the long winter rains, it ran fast and deep and cold. The current at Remagen pushed at about 7 miles per hour. The depth in the channel ran past 30 feet. The United States Army Corps of Engineers, in its own pre-invasion studies, called the Rhine totally unfordable, even at low water. There were no shallow stretches a tank could drive across. The river itself was a wall. It was also a wall with history. Roman legions had bridged it in 17 days under Caesar. Napoleon's armies had crossed it. The Allies of 1918 had occupied it. In every century, the Rhine had been the line at which Germany either began or ended. By the spring of 1945, the Reich had lost almost everything west of it. The Wehrmacht's calculation, repeated in staff meeting after staff meeting, was that the river itself would buy those 3 months, perhaps 4, perhaps long enough for political miracles, for the Western Allies to fall out among themselves, for the Vergeltungswaffen to bite. They had every reason to believe this. The river, in its blunt physical fact, was the strongest thing they still had. Hitler's order on the bridges was therefore total. Of the 47 road and rail bridges that had originally spanned the Rhine, by March 1, 1945, only 4 still stood. 3 would be blown by the Wehrmacht itself within 48 hours. The Hohenzollern Bridge in Cologne dropped on March 6. The Bonn Road Bridge dropped on the evening of March 8. The Crown Prince Wilhelm Bridge at Ermitz dropped on March 9. That left exactly 1. The Ludendorff Railway Bridge at Remagen. The order on demolitions was strict and contradictory at the same time. After an American bomb in October 1944 had prematurely detonated charges already wired to the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne, dropping it weeks before the Allies were anywhere near, Hitler had decreed that Rhine bridge charges could be installed only when the enemy was within roughly 5 miles, that the firing wires could be connected only on direct order, and that the charges could be detonated only on a written instruction from a named senior officer. Any officer who blew a bridge prematurely faced a flying court-martial. Any officer who lost a bridge intact faced the same. German engineer officers in March of 1945 lived inside that contradiction. Move too soon and you would be shot. Move too late and you would be shot. Across the river, what was left of the German army was a patchwork of exhausted men. Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B held the Ruhr stretch, with 15th Army opposite Remagen and 5th Panzer Army defending the industrial heartland. To the south, Army Group G held the Saar and Palatinate. To the north, Army Group H held the lower Rhine. The divisions on paper were ghosts. Most were Volksgrenadier formations, fed by old men, by Hitler youth boys of 16 and 17, by Luftwaffe ground crew handed rifles, by the walking wounded sent back from hospitals. The Volkssturm, the home defense levy, manned much of the bank with captured French, Belgian, Italian, and Soviet rifles. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring would later describe the task of defending the West in those weeks as playing a Beethoven sonata on an old, rickety, out-of-tune piano. Facing them, on a 450-mile broad front from the North Sea down to the Swiss border, stood 5 million Allied soldiers in 3 army groups. In the north was Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, with the United States 9th Army under Lieutenant General William Simpson placed under his command for the Rhine assault. In the center was Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, with 1st Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges and 3rd Army under Lieutenant General George Patton. In the south was Lieutenant General Jacob Devers' 6th Army Group, with the United States 7th Army and the French 1st Army. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had imposed his broad front strategy on the campaign. He wanted the entire western bank of the Rhine cleared before any deliberate crossing, and he wanted Montgomery's army group to make the main set-piece effort in the north. Montgomery's plan, codenamed Operation Plunder, was massive and methodical. It was scheduled to begin on the night of March 23 to 24, 1945, and not a day earlier. He was building up 1.2 million men. He was stockpiling 60,000 tons of ammunition and 30,000 tons of engineer stores. He had ordered up 25,000 wooden pontoons and 2,000 assault boats. A 60-mile artificial smokescreen had been running along the western bank for a week. By every German assessment, an opposed crossing of the Rhine could not be made before the night of March 23. The river was too big, the current too strong, the engineering problem too vast. That was the assumption that broke at Remagen. The Ludendorff Bridge had been begun in 1916 by Russian prisoners of war and finished in 1919. It carried 2 railway tracks and pedestrian catwalks across about 325 meters of main steel structure with a central arch of 156 meters. 2 pairs of stone towers anchored each end as 3-story strong points. Cavities in the piers, originally built to hold demolition charges, had been filled with concrete by the French Army of Occupation in the 1920s, then re-rigged by the Wehrmacht after Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936. By the morning of March 7th, the German garrison at Remagen was a patchwork. Captain Willy Brachy, a hardened Wehrmacht infantry officer with 2 Iron Crosses, commanded the Bridge Defense Company, 36 convalescents, some physically unable to fire a rifle. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, a 50-year-old veteran of the First World War, commanded the engineer detachment, about 125 older reservists. Beyond these were 180 Hitler Youth Boys, a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft unit, a small specialist rocket launcher battery, and roughly 500 Volkssturm. About 1,000 men in total, and most were unreliable. On the night of March 6 to 7, 14 flak gunners simply walked away. Friesenhahn had requested 600 kilograms of military explosive. He received only 300 kilograms, and not even Wehrmacht-grade Donnerit, but the weaker, ammonium nitrate civilian Donnerite used in mining. He placed it all on the southeastern pier. An electric firing wire ran to a detonator station inside a 1,257-foot rail tunnel cut into the cliff called the Erpeler Lay on the eastern bank. A primer cord ran from the same point as a manual backup. Command was already collapsing around him. The corps commander responsible for the sector had wandered into American lines and been captured the night before. At 1:20 in the morning on March 7th, a different German general, 40 miles away, appointed his own adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, to take charge of Remagen, and sent him with 8 men and a radio truck. The truck became separated in the darkness. Scheller arrived in Remagen at about 11:15 in the morning, on foot, with no communications, no knowledge of the ground, and only a few hours before the Americans appeared on the heights. On the American side, the 9th Armored Division, the Phantom Division of Major General John Leonard, had no reason to expect the bridge to be standing. They were pushing south through the Eifel forests. The lead element on the morning of March 7 was Combat Command B, under Brigadier General William Hogue. The Northern Column, Task Force Engerman, named for Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman of the 14th Tank Battalion, included a reconnaissance troop. Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, under Major Murray Devers, one platoon of the 9th Armored Engineer Battalion, under Lieutenant Hugh Mott of Nashville, Tennessee, and 3 companies of the 14th Tank Battalion, equipped with the brand-new M26 Pershing tank. At 12:56 in the afternoon, scouts of the leading platoon emerged from the pines on the bluffs above the town. The fog had burned off. A sergeant in the lead element raised his binoculars, lowered them, raised them again, and muttered, "Jesus, look at that! Do you know what river that is?" Below them, German vehicles, half-tracks and stragglers were still crossing the bridge eastward. Engerman radioed Hogue. Hogue, who had been ordered to swing south to link with Patton, faced the decision of his career. He later said that he could never have lived with the knowledge that he had given up that opportunity without making a try for it, that here was the opportunity of a lifetime, and it had to be grasped immediately. He ordered Engerman to take the bridge. The assault company was Lieutenant Karl Heinrich Timmermann's company. A. Timmermann was 22 years old. His father, an American soldier of German background, had served in the United States Army of Occupation after the First World War, gone absent in 1921, and been branded a deserter. The young lieutenant was acutely conscious of carrying that family stigma. He had been given the company only the day before, after the regular commander was wounded. As Timmermann's men descended into the town, 4 of the new Pershings worked over the German positions on the heights of the Erpeler Lay with their 90mm guns, knocking out a German train at 800 yards. At 1400 hours, with American tanks already on the western ramp, Friesenhahn detonated a preliminary charge that blew a 30-foot crater in the approach embankment. Scheller and Brattage entered the railway tunnel where the detonator switch was. Friesenhahn followed. Before he could reach them, an American shell exploded close enough to knock him unconscious for 15 minutes. When he came to, Brattage was screaming at him to blow the bridge. Friesenhahn, mindful of Hitler's order, demanded the order in writing. Brattage ran the curving 1,257-foot tunnel back to Scheller, secured the written order, and ran back. Friesenhahn now demanded that Brattage sign as well. At 15:20 hours, Friesenhahn finally connected the detonator and twisted the handle. Nothing happened. He twisted again. Nothing. A tank shell or a shell fragment had severed the protected steel pipe carrying the firing wires. He called for a volunteer to crawl out under fire and light the primer cord on the backup charge. A German engineer corporal named Anton Faust stepped forward. He ran some 80 yards through bullets and white phosphorus smoke to the eastern pier, lit the cord, and dashed back. At about 15:50 hours, there was a tremendous roar. The bridge seemed to lift in the air and then settle back on its supports. The 300-kilogram civilian-grade charge had blown out the eastern catwalk and a 30-foot section of the southern truss. The bridge stood. On the western bank, Timmermann's men had been lying flat in the rubble, watching the smoke billow. One soldier said, "Thank God, now we will not have to cross that thing." Timmermann stared through the smoke and yelled, "Look, she is still standing." At 15:50 hours, Company A started across. White phosphorus screened the run. Staff Sergeant Joseph Delicio's 3rd Platoon led, followed by the engineers, Lieutenant Mott, Staff Sergeant John Reynolds, and Sergeant Eugene Dorland. The 3 engineers were the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Americans onto the span. They cut wires as they ran. They threw demolition packages into the water below. Dorland chopped through the main detonation switch box on the far shore with an axe. The first man across the entire bridge was Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a 34-year-old butcher from Holland, Ohio, the son of Polish immigrants. He covered the bridge in a sprint, his helmet flying off halfway, and never stopped. He later described it in simple terms. He said they ran down the middle of the bridge, shouting as they went. He said he did not stop, because he knew that if he kept moving, they could not hit him. He said his men were in squad column, and not one of them was hit. Delisio cleared the eastern bridge towers, throwing German machine guns out the windows. Other sergeants cleared the second tower. Lieutenant Emmett Burrows climbed the cliff of the Erpel Allee to deal with snipers. Inside the railway tunnel, Bracher and Friesenhahn realized that the Americans held both ends. Hundreds of civilians crowded into the tunnel begging for the firing to stop. A white flag was fashioned from a sheet. Friesenhahn and Bracher were the last two men taken prisoner inside the tunnel. By 1730 hours, Company A had the eastern bridgehead. By 2200 hours, with Mott's engineers reflooring the span and a plough-equipped Sherman shoving fill into the western crater, the first American Sherman tanks were rolling across. By the evening of March 8, 8,000 American troops were on the eastern bank in a bridgehead 2 miles wide and 1 mile deep. When word reached Supreme Headquarters that night, the line that came back through the chain of command, attributed variously to Eisenhower or his chief of staff Walter Bedell Smith, was that the bridge was worth its weight in gold. General Bradley, learning of it from Hodges by telephone, exclaimed, "Hot dog, Courtney, this will bust him wide open." A soldier with a paintbrush soon nailed a handmade sign over the western approach. It read, "Cross the Rhine with dry feet," courtesy of the 9th Armoured Division. Drabick and Timmerman were both awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Mott and Dorland received the same for the engineers' work. Combat Command B of the 9th Armoured Division was awarded a Presidential Unit citation. The reaction in Berlin was incandescent. Joseph Goebbels confided to his diary that the failure to blow the Remagen Bridge might well be due to sabotage, or at least to serious negligence, and that the Führer had ordered an inquiry and would impose a death sentence on anyone found guilty. Hitler dismissed Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West on March 10 and replaced him with Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, recalled from Italy. The same day, he summoned Lieutenant General Rudolf Hübner, a hardline Nazi from the Eastern Front with no legal training, and put him in charge of a flying special court-martial west. Hitler demanded at least 3 death sentences, one of them a general. The general was Major General Richard von Bothmer, the battle commandant of Bonn. Tried by a separate corps-level tribunal in early March, he reached for a pistol on the courtroom table and shot himself before sentence could be carried out. Within 10 days, 4 officers stood before firing squads in the woods of the Westerwald. Major Hans Scheller, the corps adjutant who had assumed command of Remagen only 3 hours before its capture. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, the anti-aircraft officer whose secret rocket launcher battery had been overrun. Major Herbert Strobel, of the Engineer Regimental Staff. And Major August Kraft, the Engineer Battalion commander whose men had laid the charges, though Kraft himself had been 40 kilometers away at the moment of capture. The trials, in restaurants and farmhouses near villages with names like Rimbach and Oberösen, lasted minutes. Their families' pension rights were stripped. The letters they were allowed to write before execution were burned. Captain Willy Brache, in American captivity, was tried in absentia and condemned to death. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, also in American hands, was tried in absentia and acquitted, the court finding he had done all that was in his power. 2 decades later, a German court would posthumously overturn every one of Hübner's death sentences. Kesselring rebuked his troops in a special order that read, "We have suffered unnecessary losses, and our present military situation has become nearly catastrophic." The message was unmistakable. The Reich would now shoot its own engineers to keep the Rhine. It would not be enough. For the United States First Army, the Ludendorff Bridge was a damaged, slowly dying lifeline. From March 7 to March 17, the Germans threw at it virtually every weapon in the Reich's arsenal. American gunners counted 367 distinct German aircraft attacking over those 10 days. They ringed the bridge with what Army historians later called the greatest concentration of anti-aircraft weapons during the Second World War. By March 13, 672 anti-aircraft weapons were posted around the crossing. On March 8, the Luftwaffe lost 3 Stukas and a Fokker-Wulf 190 in the first attack. On March 13, the heaviest day, the Luftwaffe ran 91 sorties, including the brand-new Messerschmitt Me-2 6.2 jet fighter bombers and Arado AR-234 jet bombers, the world's first operational jet bomber. On March 14, an American P-51 pilot caught one of those Arados turning slowly after its bomb run and shot it down, one of the first air-to-air kills of an AR-234 jet in the war. American gunners claimed 26 aircraft destroyed and 9 damaged on March 13 alone. Despite the sortie count, despite the jets, despite the dive bombers, no German bomb hit the Ludendorff Bridge. On March 14, Hitler ordered the V-2 force to attack the bridge. The General Staff was appalled, since to fire the inaccurate ballistic rockets at a target on German soil meant near certain civilian casualties. They obeyed. On March 17, an SS unit at Hellendoorn in the Netherlands, 200 kilometers north of Remagen, fired 11 V-2s at the bridge. It was the only time V-2s were ever fired at a tactical target, and the only time they were fired on German soil. The closest impact landed about 270 meters from the bridge. One warhead reached Cologne, 64 kilometers off course. One struck the village of Oedingen. At 12:20 in the afternoon, one detonated near the command post of B Company, 284th Engineer Combat Battalion, in a 2-story inn in Remagen, killing 3 engineers and wounding 31 more. The Germans floated explosives, laden barges and drifting mines downriver. The 164th Engineer Combat Battalion had built a system of log and net booms upstream that intercepted them. Hermann Goering called for suicide ramming missions on the bridge by jet pilots. No volunteers came forward. The Germans ranged in more than 100 artillery pieces, including a 280mm railway gun called Heavy Bruno and the 600mm Super Heavy Karl mortar, the largest self-propelled mortar in the world, which fired 14 shells before withdrawing with mechanical failure. On the night of March 17 to 18, with the Ludendorff already collapsed, an SS commando unit dispatched 7 combat swimmers from a Danube-based commando under a young lieutenant. They were equipped with Italian Pirelli rebreather rigs and floating oil drums of explosive. They had to enter the Rhine 17 kilometers upstream of the target, in water that was about 7 degrees Celsius. They were caught in the beams of a top-secret American searchlight unit, the 738th Tank Battalion, which used Sherman tanks fitted with carbon arc lamps of 13 million candle power. It was the first combat use of those lights in the European war. All 7 were killed or captured. Through this gauntlet, men, vehicles and supplies poured east. Within 10 days, 6 full divisions and over 25,000 troops were in the bridgehead. By the time the Americans broke out of the bridgehead on March 25, 125,000 men had crossed. But the bridge itself was dying. The 276th Engineer Combat Battalion had relieved the exhausted 9th Armoured Engineers on March 10. The 1058th Engineer Port Construction and Repair Group came up to make the bridge truly load-bearing. They worked under continuous artillery and aerial harassment. At about 1500 hours on March 17, engineers heard the sharp crack of rivets breaking. The arch failed. The centre span and adjacent sections folded into the Rhine, taking dozens of men down with them. Approximately 28 American engineers were killed, with 93 wounded and 11 missing, presumed drowned. Survivors described the men in the water trying to keep their heads above the surface, weighed down by heavy gear in a current too fast to fight. By that hour, it no longer mattered. The American engineers had already done what no German planner had thought possible. On the afternoon of March 8th, while the Arado jets circled overhead and shells walked the riverbank, Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin's 291st Engineer Combat Battalion was ordered to throw the first true tactical bridge across the Rhine. Pergrin's men were already legends in the United States Army. They were the engineers who had blown the bridges at Trois Ponts and Stavelot in front of the panzers of SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper in December. They had found and uncovered the bodies in the snow at Malmedy. They were called the damned engineers of the Bulge. Now they were given the Rhine. Pergrin chose a site about a quarter-mile downstream from the Ludendorff Bridge. The doctrinal expectation in the United States Army for an M2 steel treadway floating bridge was about 50 feet of bridge per hour. The Rhine here was 1,032 feet wide. The current was 7 miles per hour. The depth at midstream was over 30 feet. Construction began at 0830 hours on March 9. Each pontoon was a 33-foot, 8-foot wide pneumatic float made of rubberized canvas. Each weighed about 1,000 pounds when dry, far more when wet. Steel saddles were lashed to the floats. 12-foot interchangeable steel treadway sections were pinned to the saddles. Engineers in assault boats had to drop 100-pound anchors upstream and run a 1.5-inch steel cable from shore to shore as the bridge grew. They did this while German panzers in the village of Erpel poured direct fire across the water, and the Luftwaffe strafed and bombed. Pergrin and his men completed the bridge at 1710 hours on March 10, 32 hours after the first float hit the water, 1,032 feet across, the first Allied bridge over the Rhine. The longest tactical bridge ever assembled under enemy fire to that date in the history of warfare. By the end of the war, the 291st would build 23 timber bridges, 44 Bailey bridges, and 7 treadway bridges, 11 of them under fire. They would clear 7,000 mines and take 8,500 German prisoners. They were a battalion of about 600 men. A sister battalion, the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, through the second crossing, a heavy pontoon bridge, alongside. By March 17, the day the original bridge collapsed, 2 American treadway pontoon bridges already stood north of it, carrying the entire weight of the bridgehead. Within a week of the capture, 8 United States Army bridges spanned the Rhine in the Remagen sector. Then it was Patton's turn. On March 19, General Bradley told Patton to cross the Rhine. The classic doctrinal expectation, hammered out before the war, held that an opposed Rhine crossing required weeks of preparation, set-piece artillery, smoke generators, airborne support, and assault boats stockpiled for months. Bradley had quietly authorized Patton to do it any way he liked. Convoys carrying boats and bridge equipment cached in Lorraine since the previous autumn started rolling forward the same day. Patton chose his ground with a deception. While the 90th Division laid a great smokescreen at Mainz and made every visible motion of an assault, the 5th Red Diamond Infantry Division, under Major General Leroy Irwin, the spearhead of 12th Corps, would slip across about 10 miles upstream at the small towns of Oppenheim and Nierstein, with no preparatory bombardment, no airstrike, and no airborne drop. Patton drove his subordinate Eddie hard. He said, "We have to get a bridgehead at once. Every day we save means the saving of hundreds of American lives, and we can take the Rhine on the run." At 2200 hours on March 22, 1945, the 11th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Paul Black launched. 3rd Battalion crossed at Nierstein. 1st Battalion crossed at Oppenheim. About 500 assault boats had been brought up. They were manned by the 204th Engineer Combat Battalion and the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion. By 0300 hours on March 23, the United States Navy's Lieutenant Commander William Lyday had a flotilla of landing craft in the river. There was almost no resistance. 7 Germans on the eastern bank surrendered on the spot, apparently unaware that an American army was crossing the river. The 5th Division's casualties for the entire assault crossing were just 20 men. By dawn, the division was firmly across, with the 90th Division and the 4th Armored Division behind it. Engineers immediately threw a 1,896-foot M2 treadway across the river, completed in roughly 18 hours. A heavy pontoon bridge alongside it was open at 0700 hours on March 24. Patton was on the phone to Bradley before dawn on March 23. He said, "Brad, do not tell anyone, but I am across." Bradley said, "Well, I will be damned. You mean across the Rhine?" Patton said, "Sure am. I sneaked a division over last night, but there are so few Germans around that they do not know it yet, so do not make any announcement." That evening, Bradley released the news to the press, deliberately, in his own later words, at a time calculated to take some of the luster from the news of Montgomery's crossing. Patton, blunt as ever, told Bradley, "I want the world to know that 3rd Army made it before Monty starts across." On March 24, Patton drove out to the engineer-built pontoon bridge at Oppenheim. He had, by his own account, deliberately not urinated all morning so as to have, as he put it, a really full load. Halfway across the bridge he stopped, unbuttoned, and relieved himself into the Rhine, while army photographers recorded the moment. He said, "I have been looking forward to this for a long time." On the eastern bank, in conscious imitation of William the Conqueror's landing in England in 1066, he stumbled deliberately, fell, and rose with 2 fistfuls of German earth. He said, "Thus, William the Conqueror." The line that came down to us, repeated in barracks for decades after, was that he sent a cable to Supreme Headquarters declaring he had pissed in the Rhine and asking for more gasoline. In Patton's general order to the 3rd Army that day, He set out the scale of what the engineers had supported between January 29th and March 22. He said his army had wrested 6,484 square miles of territory from the enemy, taken 3,072 cities and towns, and captured 140,112 enemy soldiers, eliminating practically all of the German 7th and 1st Armies. Other Third Army crossings followed in days, all engineer-built. The 87th Division crossed at Boppard on March 25. The 89th crossed at St. Goar on March 26. The 4th Infantry Division crossed at Worms on March 26 on a pontoon bridge built by the 85th Engineer Heavy Pontoon Battalion. Within 48 hours of the first Oppenheim crossing, Lieutenant Commander Lyde's boat units had ferried over 15,000 troops and 1,200 vehicles. Now look north, where Montgomery's set piece was unfolding in deliberate counterpoint to the American improvisation. Operation Plunder opened at 2100 hours on March 23, with the heaviest set-piece preparation in the Western European campaign. Approximately 4,000 Allied guns fired for 4 hours along a 35-kilometre front. More than 37,000 British and 22,000 American engineers were committed. Royal Air Force Bomber Command flattened the city of Wesel before the assault. The British 51st Highland Division began crossing at Rees at 2100 hours. The 15th Scottish Division crossed between Wesel and Rees at 0200 hours on March 24. South of Wesel, Simpson's United States 9th Army launched Operation Flashpoint. Its 30th Infantry and 79th Infantry Divisions crossed against light opposition. American casualties were just 41 killed, 450 wounded, and 7 missing. The savage prior bombardment had done its work. On the morning of March 24 came Operation Varsity, the largest single-lift airborne operation in history. 16,870 paratroopers and glider troops of the United States 18th Airborne Corps under Major General Matthew Ridgway. The American 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division were flown in a stream that took 2 hours and 37 minutes to pass any single point. They were escorted by more than 2,100 fighters. All ground objectives were taken. Then the Wesel engineering effort began on a scale that humbled even Plunder's planners. On the night of March 23, Companies E and C of the 17th Armored Engineer Battalion of the United States 2nd Armored Division started building treadway rafts, about 5 kilometers south of Wesel. The next morning, at 0945 hours on March 24, full bridge construction began at Spellen. By 1600 hours that same day, 6 hours and 15 minutes later, an 1,152-foot M2 treadway bridge with 93 pneumatic floats was open to traffic. 25 trucks of the Red Ball Express had hauled the parts. United States Army engineer reports later judged that this was the fastest bridge of that size ever built. Company E of the 17th Armored Engineer Battalion was awarded a Distinguished Unit Citation for the action. By March 28, the United States 9th Army alone had 12 bridges spanning the Rhine in its sector, and a bridgehead 35 miles wide and up to 20 miles deep. A coordinated force under Colonel James Kress, including the 355th Engineer General Service Regiment, the 1056th Engineer Port Construction and Repair Group, and a United States Navy Seabee detachment, began on March 29 to throw the Wesel Railway Bridge. United States Army historians wrote that it was the first fixed bridge built by any Army engineer to span the Rhine since the days of Caesar. The structure ran 1,753 feet over the Rhine. Working 12-hour shifts under floodlights and balloon barrage, the engineers opened the bridge to a 50-car test train at 0100 hours on April 9, 1945. 10 days, 4 hours, and 45 minutes after the first pile was driven. The bridge was named for Major Robert Gouldin, an engineer officer killed in its construction. A parallel highway bridge, the Roosevelt Bridge at Wesel, named for the recently deceased president, opened to traffic on April 18, 1945. The 332nd Engineer General Service Regiment's even longer Victory Bridge at Duisburg was finished on VE Day itself, May 8, 1945. The doctrinal handbook for what these men did was dry. The reality was not. The field manual for the M2 steel treadway bridge listed the components in the language of a parts catalogue. a pneumatic float weighing 1,000 pounds, an 8-foot saddle, a 12-foot steel treadway plate. The manual specified a working party of 78 men to build a 362-foot bridge in 5.5 hours by day, 7.5 hours by night. An M2 treadway floating bridge could carry tanks of up to 40 short tons. A combat engineer battalion was a 600-man formation. The men were trained as sappers, road builders, mine clearers, and assault engineers, but they were armed and required to fight as infantry. Behind them stood the Theatre Engineer Organisation under Major General Cecil Moore, Chief Engineer of the European Theatre, who had built up the unprecedented stockpile of bridging in Lorraine in late 1944, specifically for the Rhine. Brigadier General William Carter ran 12th Army Group Engineer operations. In the aggregate, United States Army engineers built roughly 60 tactical bridges across the Rhine between March 7 and the end of April 1945, plus the first 2 semi-permanent fixed bridges. Engineer-supported assaults moved more than 60,000 vehicles and several 100,000 men over the river before April was out. The 284th Engineer Combat Battalion had 3 killed and 31 wounded when the V2 hit their command post in Remagen. The 276th lost 6 killed and 11 missing when the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed under them. The 355th Engineer General Service Regiment lost 3 at Wessel, including Major Robert Gouldin, for whom the railway bridge was named. This is what the German command could not fit into its picture of the war. The shock is documented in their own words. Major General Karl Wagner, Walter Model's Chief of Staff, told his commander after Remagen that the loss of the bridge signalled the end of the war. Hermann Göring concurred, saying the capture made a long defence impossible. Field Marshal Kesselring, on taking up his new role on March 10, called Remagen the crime of Remagen and said it had broken the front along the Rhine. Joseph Goebbels confided to his diary on March 11 that the Remagen bridgehead caused the Führer much anxiety. On March 24, after Patton was over and plunder had begun, he was franker still. He wrote that the situation in the West had entered an extraordinarily critical, ostensibly almost deadly, phase. But the deeper disbelief, in the German command, lay in the speed with which the Americans then moved engineering across the river. Walter Model spent the second week of March insisting to General Gustav Adolf von Zangen of 15th Army that the American main thrust would still come north of Remagen, near Cologne. He could not believe that what was already happening in front of him was the main effort, because it was developing too quickly for an opposed river crossing. By the time he understood what was happening, the bridgehead had already broken out. Colonel General Alfred Jodel's testimony at Nuremberg repeatedly emphasized the same theme. The German High Command's pre-war and wartime planning had assumed any opposed Rhine crossing would consume 4 to 6 weeks of Allied preparation. The American 12th Army Group's after-action analyses make the same point from the opposite direction. Even American doctrine had assumed roughly 5.5 hours per 362-foot section of M2 treadway under fire, and a casualty rate of 2 engineers per 100 feet. Both numbers were beaten at Remagen, at Oppenheim, and at Wessel. The Americans broke their own peacetime engineers' standards. German engineer, staff officers, interrogated after the war for the United States Army's Foreign Military Studies series, returned again and again to a single point. The Wehrmacht's own engineer battalions had been organized as slow, deliberate road-building outfits, not unlike civil contractors in uniform. The Americans, the German engineer prisoners told their interrogators, treated bridge construction as combat itself, a frontline assault discipline conducted at the speed of an infantry attack. German doctrine had simply never anticipated that a republic, only 9 years out of the Great Depression, with an army of fewer than 200,000 men in 1939, would build such a corps, and put it on its rivers in such numbers, at such speed, and under such fire. A captured Wehrmacht engineer officer, looking out across the river at the 291st's Treadway Bridge, reportedly told an American interrogator a single line that survived in the records of the 12th Army Group. He said, "We did not believe it possible." The strategic consequences fell quickly. By March 25, the First Army broke out of the Remagen bridgehead. Hodges's troops, joined by Patton's racing south, swept north and east. On April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, lead elements of the United States 1st and 9th Armies met near the town of Lippstadt, completing the encirclement of Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B. Inside the resulting Ruhr pocket, a 30 by 75-mile pocket of railway yards, coal mines, and bombed-out cities, were the 5th Panzer Army, the 15th Army, 2 corps of the 1st Parachute Army, the remnants of roughly 21 understrength divisions, an admiral, around 2 dozen generals, and 370,000 troops. By April 14, the pocket was halved at the city of Hagen. The eastern half surrendered on April 16, the western on April 18. The final tally was approximately 317,000 prisoners. It was the single largest German surrender of the war in the West, larger than the German surrender at Stalingrad. Walter Model himself refused to be, in his words, a field marshal who became a prisoner. By the middle of April, he dissolved Army Group B rather than formally surrender. On April 21, 1945, he walked into a wood near Duisburg and shot himself in the head with his service pistol. Adolf Hitler killed himself on April 30. Germany surrendered on May 7th. Colonel General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional capitulation at Supreme Headquarters in Reims on the same day. The actual schedule had been set, instead, by Brigadier General Hodges Gamble at Remagen, by the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion's 32-hour bridge, by Patton's lightning crossing at Oppenheim, and by the engineers who flooded the river behind them all. What happened on the Rhine in March 1945 came down to a broken assumption. The German High Command had assumed that a great river was, by itself, a barrier. The Americans had assumed nothing of the kind. The difference between those two assumptions, multiplied across 1,000 pneumatic floats and 10,000 engineers, was the difference between a war that ended in May 1945 and one that the Wehrmacht had hoped to drag into the next year. Of the bridge at Remagen itself, almost nothing remains today. The collapsed steel was lifted from the river in the summer of 1976 because it was a hazard to navigation. The 4 basalt towers, 2 on each bank, still stand. In 1980, Hans-Peter Curtin, the long-serving mayor of Remagen, opened the Peace Museum at the bridge of Remagen, inside the western towers. He financed the project in part by selling small chunks of the dismantled river piers as paperweights, each with a certificate of authenticity. The museum's motto is carved on its wall. It reads, "Every day let us work for peace, with our mind and heart. Each person should begin with himself." Inside its rooms, visitors can see Lieutenant Karl-Heinrich Timmermann's helmet, photographs of Sergeant Alex Drabik with the Distinguished Service Cross at his throat, the German engineer Friesenhahn's account of the failed detonation, and the rehabilitated photograph of Major Hans Scheller. There is a small chapel nearby for the German prisoners who died of exposure in the open meadow camps, just south of the town in the spring of 1945. At Oppenheim, at Nierstein, at Boppard, at St. Goar, at Worms, at Wessel, smaller stone monuments mark the places where American engineers laid the bridges that broke the river. One of them, a granite block at Nierstein with 3 copper plaques, commemorates the silent crossing of the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion. The Wessel-Roosevelt Bridge is gone, replaced after the war. The Gouldin Railway Bridge was dismantled within a year of the war's end. Of all the engineer-built tactical bridges of March 1945, none survives in the river itself. Their legacy is in the photographs and the after-action reports of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, in the unit histories of the 291st and the 17th Armored Engineer Battalion, and in the names of small towns in Ohio and Tennessee and Pennsylvania, where the men who carried treadway pins came home and lived ordinary lives. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, who had stared through the smoke and yelled, "Look, she is still standing," lived only 6 more years. He served again in Korea. He died of cancer at Fitzsimons Army Hospital in Denver, Colorado, on October 21, 1951, at the age of 29. He was buried at Fort Logan National Cemetery. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, the butcher from Holland, Ohio, who had been first across the span, came home, returned to his trade, and was killed in a car accident in 1993. His Distinguished Service Cross was never upgraded to the Medal of Honor, despite a bill repeatedly introduced by Representative Marcy Kaptur of Ohio over many years. Lieutenant Hugh Mott, who had cut the wires under fire, became a Major General of the Tennessee National Guard. Brigadier General William Hoge, who had decided in 2 minutes on a forest road that the bridge had to be taken, ended his career as the Commander-in-Chief of United States Army Europe. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin of the 291st wrote his battalion's history, first across the Rhine, published in 1989. He died in 2012. What the United States Army did between March 7 and March 25, 1945, on the river the Wehrmacht had counted on to save the Reich. It is not a story about a single sergeant running across a single bridge, although that did happen. It is not a story about one general's gamble, although that happened too. It is a story about an entire institution, the United States Army Corps of Engineers, which between 1939 and 1945 had grown from a small peacetime organization with no operational pontoon bridge of any consequence into a force capable of placing on a single contested river, in less than 3 weeks, dozens of bridges that the German command did not believe could be placed there at all. They did it under the V2, under the new jets, under the largest mortar in the world, in a current that in places ran at 11 kilometers per hour. And in the eyes of the men who could see them from the eastern bank, their work moved at a tempo that simply did not match the war as those men understood it. The Rhine had been the river of Caesar and Charlemagne and Bonaparte. For 2,000 years it had been a frontier, a moat, a definition of where Germany began. In 10 days in March of 1945, men whose names most of the world has never learned, in pneumatic boats with outboard motors, holding pliers in their teeth and signal flags in their hands, turned that ancient river into something it had never been. They turned it into a road. The Germans who watched them do it were not wrong to find the achievement astonishing. They were only wrong to believe, for as long as they did, that it was impossible. And by the time they understood that it was not, the war was already over.